I said that would be a true pleasure for me to do so. The whole anecdote, the story of the Icelandic collapse of Iceland's endurance during the crisis has some universal appeal, I believe. There are aspects of that story that relate to all of us, but most interestingly, importantly for us, it is a story that we believe is a success story, and we do hope that our example can offer a lesson, can be a warning also, but can offer a lesson to others. What I thought I might do is to give you a brief overview of how things came to what they did in Iceland in the autumn of 2008. Perhaps explain a little about how the government responded to the crisis, what worked, what didn't, and how we have been able to make progress from there. And then perhaps at the very end, tell you a little bit about the regime reform that we have undertaken in the field of fiscal matters. I believe that subject will appeal to the audience. As for the introduction, I should say that during 2008, when at the onset of the crisis, I was working as permanent secretary in the Ministry of Education and Culture, and leading a rather stable and quiet life, so to speak. Now that was to change. The events in October 2008 took everybody by surprise, and in December, I was approached by the then Prime Minister to join his staff at the Prime Minister's office to come and coordinate the cross-departmental response to the crisis, which I did, only for that government to fall a little later. And after a new coalition came to office, I was again asked to join, to change posts, and I became permanent secretary in the Ministry of Finance under very particular circumstances in the spring of 2009. Now, this beautiful picture we have here on the screen depicts the glacial lagoon, which you will see if you drive the southern coast of Iceland. And by the end of the introduction, I'll even show you a road map so you know how to get there. Now, perhaps I should divide I thought it might be for as a matter of clarity and comprehension, divide the presentation broadly into three phases, and then adding the organic budget law. We talk about the period of the upheaval when there was a great expansion taking place, not only in the Icelandic economy, but in the financial sector worldwide, and in particular in Europe, and Iceland was part of that. Then came the onset of the crisis, and as I will go into a little later, we entered a program with the IMF, which ended in 2011, and that we refer to as the period of stabilization. After the program came to an end, well ahead of time, in 2011, we see the period thereafter as a period of consolidation. Now, Mr. Arti told you a little bit about the island of Iceland, sitting there in the midst of the North Atlantic, about 3 hours flying time from London, from Copenhagen, from 5.5 hours from the US. We Iceland has come a long way economically. Around 100 years ago, Iceland was probably the poorest country in Western Europe, but that has changed, not least due to the progress, the achievements we have made in terms of utilizing our marine resources, which I think is a topic very relevant to the future growth of Oman, having a wealth of biological resources in your waters. Now, politically, we are a presidential democracy. We have a parliament. We are members of the European Economic Area. And for people who are not familiar with what that is, that it can be viewed as a kind of an associate membership of the EU. We are members of the European Free Trade Association with Switzerland, Liechtenstein, and Norway. And for those who have been following the discussion and the debate on Brexit, Do I continue? Yeah. Britain gaining membership or regaining membership of EFTA and then becoming member of the European Economic Area has been named as one of the options, identified as one of the options that Britain could take. But we who are already members of the European Economic Area do not believe that Britain would ever feel very happy being member of the European Economic Area, because basically, or virtually, we do translate 85% of legislation coming from the EU directly into our national legislation, but we do not have a seat at the table when decisions are being taken. But this membership of the EEA has served us very well. We are de facto integral part of the internal market. So we have a free flow of capital, goods, people, services. Now, we celebrated last week our 100 years of sovereignty from Denmark, and we formally ended and became independent in 1944 when we divorced, made a very peaceful divorce settlement with the Kingdom of Denmark. Now, it has already been mentioned, and I'm sure that many of you will be familiar with what it was that caused the financial crisis, or what the characteristics of the process leading to the buildup of the financial crisis, what they consisted of. For us, the Icelandic banks, which had been privatized in the late 1990s and 2000s, they went very aggressively on an expansion abroad, and Iceland became one of the poster childs of the international financial system at the time. The Icelandic banks, building not least on a very fine reputation earned by the Icelandic sovereign, expanded very, very rapidly. We had large inflows of kronas, of foreign currency. We had credit was cheap, and assets amplified in price. Now, this was, of course, not confined to Iceland. We had similar developments taking place, and we in Northern Europe, in the UK, elsewhere. And as it happens, when one goes through the list of banks and financial institutions that went bust and after 2008, that list is very, very, very long. Iceland perhaps became a very publicized example of this development because it was visualized in international media, and it was a drama that evolved from day to day, and the whole global audience had its eyes set on Iceland at the time. Now, as time progressed and the international economy showed signs of contraction, it immediately became evident that this did carry a very serious threat for Iceland. The authorities had already noted, and in what we call or refer to as the mini crisis of 2006, that the expansion and the liabilities of the Icelandic financial sector had become such that if things would contract further, or if there would be general turbulence within the international financial system, then the consequences of that could be very dire for Iceland. The balance sheets of the banks had grown in 5 years, from being twice the GDP of Iceland to being to over tenfold or 10 times the size of the GDP. The practices within the financial sector were not exemplary in many respects. Risk was concentrated, ownership was concentrated, and we had a high level of what we refer to as cross-lending or connected lending. The obligations of the banks were long-term. The banks had their financing short-term, so there was a level of asymmetry in the asset and the obligations arms of the banks, which later became unsustainable as credit dried up. The year 2008 was indeed a dramatic year. We had a so-called Article 4 visit by the staff of the IMF in early 2008. And then a report published by the IMF in June 2009, it said that the long-term economic prospects of Iceland were enviable. 4 months later, it was in total ruins. Now, this picture helps you understand or realize how the balance sheets of the banks grew and how fast they grew. At the time, the Icelandic commercial banking system consisted of 3 main banks, and all of them had been pursuing a very aggressive lending strategy. Now, when the credit crunch was set on, it became immediately obvious that the authorities in Iceland stood before a situation which was absolutely colossal in every respect. What do authorities do when they realize that their entire financial sector has become infested and is about to crumble? Just trying to grasp the immensity of the situation is quite difficult, but as it happened, the authorities had for months been preparing for a scenario such as this one to materialize. So the biggest challenge was to find out how, when you have ended up with a financial system in total ruins on your hands, what do you do? And the options are many. None of them are easy, but I believe that with the benefit of hindsight, that the option pursued by the Icelandic authorities was in many respects a very fortunate one. There was talk of doing what we have seen elsewhere, where banks have been split into good banks and bad banks, and then you try and make sure that the good bank is operative, and you try and resolve the damaged assets. But in Iceland, we undertook a somewhat different approach. We split all 3 banks that had collapsed into a national or domestic and an international bank. So overnight, we set up 3 new banks, and we transferred domestic assets from the estates of the fallen banks to those new banks, and said to the creditors and claimants to the estates of the old banks, we will compensate you fairly for all the assets that we have transferred from the old banks to your new banks. And there then pursued a long negotiation with the creditors, international creditors of the banks, on how to compensate them for the assets that we used, taken from the estates of the failed banks, to build up new banks. We set up and we embarked on a program with the IMF. And this program consisted of 3 basic components. One was the reconstruction of the financial sector. Another one was the taking a firm grip of the capital sector, of the currency. A third was to devise a policy to restructure the public finances. Now, on the banking, we set up those three banks, and I was involved in the negotiations between the creditors and the authorities on the compensation. And in the end, we initial estimates when the program with the IMF was being designed was that the sovereign would have to allocate resources amounting to 25% of the GDP to finance the new banks. As it then happened, and after the negotiations we had conducted with the creditors, we convinced them that rather than us signing an IOU or making or entering or taking on obligations vis-a-vis them, they themselves should be involved in financing the new banks, and that they should retain or become part owners of the new banks. So on the first component of the IMF program, where we had envisaged to use 25% of GDP to finance the new banks, in the end, we only used something like 6 or 7%. We took full control of one bank, 15% in the second, and 5% in the third. The rest was held by the creditors. Now, from the point of view of the Treasury, of the authorities, this was an intelligent measure because given where we were, given the circumstances, there was such an enormous uncertainty surrounding everything that taking on less debt was in itself an important thing. On the capital controls, what happened when the banks collapsed was that the Icelandic krona went into free fall. The country was filled with assets held by foreigners who obviously wanted to exit as soon as they could. So overnight, capital controls were imposed, making it impossible for those who held Icelandic kronas or assets in Icelandic kronas to convert them into foreign currency. There was no foreign currency to do that. So those assets became locked up inside Iceland, and we call them offshore kronas. They did accrue interest, but the owners were not allowed to take them outside the country. Those assets have then traded very actively, and most of those who held those claims in the beginning sold off at a very low price. Many of those who bought at very low prices have made a very significant gain on their investment as the Icelandic economy then has recovered. Now, I will then comment and say a few words on the public finances a little later. But the picture you have here before you is indicative of the sheer scale of the Icelandic crisis. This is a chart that shows the volume of bankruptcies internationally measured in US dollars, billions. And as you can see, for a country of 350,000 people to feature their aggregate in number 3, and actually to be with all 3 banks on that list points to and underlines what I said before, that the task facing the authorities was intimidating and colossal. Now, this picture here also shows you how proportionally big the Icelandic banks had become. This shows the size of their balance sheets. The red or orange column shows how big the balance sheets were in 2008, and whereas the blue column shows the situation as it was in 2017. And there are a few outliers there. Iceland, of course, cited by Ireland, but there are other countries as well, Malta, Cyprus, the Netherlands, where the financial sector shrunk significantly during this period. And the absolute volume, of course, because this is relative to GDP, is much bigger in other countries than it was in Iceland. So we are happy to be where we are presently on this picture. This slide shows you how the currency regime worked, where the krona was at the time of the onset of or installment of the capital controls, and how it then evolved over time. The krona did strengthen and has been strengthening over the last 10 years due to a number of things. But one lesson we did learn was that capital controls are easy to install. You can do that overnight. And it only takes one piece of legislation to go through your parliament, and then you have the central bank imposing those controls in practice. However, removing capital controls is a much more complex thing, and the complexity cannot be overstated. When the capital controls were introduced, we would think, or people would think, economists would say, well, this is going to take us a year or 2, maybe 3. In the end, it took us, we were and I was personally in New York in March 2017, conducting a negotiation with creditors holding offshore kronas on buying those offshore kronas at a discount. So we say the capital controls were ended in March 2007, so we endured some 8 years with capital controls. And capital controls are distortive in their nature, so it is something that you do not want to have to impose. unless you necessarily have to do that. But in the case of Iceland, we are the smallest currency area in the world. There was no option. Otherwise, the krona would have been obsolete. Now, just very briefly, I'll be happy to share these slides with you. Because I don't think we will have time to go through each and every item I have on these slides. But we did go through a very thorough process conducted by the Parliament, where an investigative committee was set up to go through the entire process, the lead up, the build up to the crisis, the response to the crisis. And I think this was very diligent work, and I think there are lessons to be sought there for others as well. And I think we were quite earnest in identifying the causes to the financial crisis and why it played out so drastically in Iceland. I have already mentioned that what we did was to set up the new banks. But resolving the estates of the old banks was a complex thing. The value of these assets amounting to 10 times the GDP of Iceland, the valuation of the assets per se was a very complex thing. We had to respect, of course, needless to say, the rights of creditors, of those who had held claims against the fallen banks. So we set up independent resolution boards, one for each bank. And they only had the assignment, the objective, to try and maximize and realize the value of the estates of the fallen banks. We then set up separate winding up boards, which would be responsible for settling asset claims with creditors. And looking back, given the volume, the size, the immensity, I think it is actually remarkable that we did manage to come out of all this still on speaking terms with the creditors. The conversation was not always pleasant, but we were at least continuing the dialogue until the very end. There were complications. I don't think I will have time to go into that. Some of the Icelandic banks had set up branches. They had been collecting deposits abroad. They were very aggressive. They did so with great progress, and success, both in the UK and the Netherlands. And obviously for the authorities in those countries to then see the assets being moved into another territory, this was an unnerving situation. We had a debate, we had a conflict with the authorities both in the Netherlands and the UK as to who was responsible for depositor compensation. We said all along that we would honor Iceland's sovereign obligations, but that we should not confuse the obligations of private entities, of banks, with the obligations of the sovereign. And right from the outset, our position was that we will not socialize losses caused by private entities. So Iceland never considered seriously the option of bailing out the banks. And we can, of course, stand here like now and say we did not want to bail out the banks. But the truth is, there was no way we could have bailed out the banks. The Treasury was simply not in any position to provide the capital needed to see the banks live through the financial crisis. So they were allowed to dissolve, to fall. I think this matter of who carries the responsibility vis-a-vis the depositors. We have a European directive. The European directive applied to Iceland as it did to any other country in the European Economic Area and the EU. And we said, well, we have studied the legal case, and we believe that a sovereign is not responsible for guaranteeing deposits in financial institutions. According to the European directive, there has to be a depositor insurance scheme in each and every country, and the insurance only goes as far as the resources, the assets of those deposit insurance funds reach. This was contested. It went before the courts, and we said from the beginning we are willing and we are happy to abide by any adjudication on the matter. And in the end, the matter was brought to an adjudication before the EFTA court, which is the parallel to the EU court, and Iceland won. So the sovereign was not responsible for the deposits, but we said, and this also turned out to be right, that the emergency legislation we adopted, or Parliament adopted, gave priority access of ordinary depositors to the assets of the estates of the fallen banks. And even if there was great uncertainty as to what those assets actually amounted to, and whether how long they would suffice, as time progressed, the assets were appreciated. And in the end, every krona, every penny and cent paid out by the authorities in the Netherlands and the UK was recovered from the estates of the fallen banks. So happily for the sovereigns in the UK and in the Netherlands who who decided to compensate depositors, they recovered all their outlays. Now, we have this slide basically shows what we have been doing since. So since 2009, we have been consolidating our financial sector. We have been undertaking all kinds of reforms, and we have been installing or converting European directives into Icelandic regulation. We have been strengthening the surveillance system immensely, and undertaken various systemic reforms to ensure that our financial system does not end up in dire straits as it did. The Icelandic banks have been doing very, very well, and their capital requirements are well above and way above the Basel or the European minimum, and those three banks we now have operating in Iceland, which were built on the ruins of the old banks, all have capital ratios of around 20–22%, which bankers, of course, say is way too high. On the systemic level, we have introduced the Financial Stability Board and the Systemic Risk Committee. So we want to make it absolutely sure that that we do not get to a situation where we found ourselves. Now, interestingly, I mentioned earlier that we did inject some 7% of GDP as capital into the three new banks. And we did so because we were hesitant. We did want to minimize risk. But as things have evolved, these three banks have been doing very well. Assets that had been written down have actually proved to be worthy. And as it now stands, we did this. This slide is a little bit outdated, so the orange column, which shows the recovery and the return on the injections into the banks, would actually be higher today because we have done much more than recover every krona that we put into the banks. The return rate, like 2 years ago, was around 140%. So, and this is not a specific experience for Iceland. It's something that we have seen elsewhere too. That countries like in Sweden have won back all the assets that they have put into defunct financial systems. Now, given the visuals and the optics of what happened in Iceland, one would think that things would have been very difficult comparatively, and that Iceland would have been faring worse than other countries. But this slide actually tells you an interesting story. In the infamous year of 2009, when most countries were dealing with the aftermath of the financial crisis, the effect of the crisis in Iceland was in many respects much lesser than one would have anticipated. The Finnish economy contracted by 7.5%, Estonia 14%, Japan by 5%, Iceland by 6.5%. Now, why was this? This was because the crisis in Iceland was not an economic crisis. I know this may sound skewed, but the crisis that we had in Iceland was purely a financial crisis. Be it true that as things played out, it caused a social crisis and a political crisis, but it was not an economic crisis. Why was this? We had an adjustment of the currency, immediate effect. So the automatic stabilizers, they kicked in very forcefully. We had the adjustment of the krona rate meant that traditional sectors did very well. And we have a very strong fisheries sector, very advanced. And fisheries, which had been suffering due to the strengthening of the krona for a long time, all of a sudden found that the economic environment had improved a lot. The same applied to the energy sector, where we are very rich in hydropower, we are very rich in geothermal energy, and the energy sector recovered overnight and kicked in. Now, so as you can see on the graph there, on the upper left corner, the economy recovered remarkably fast due to the solidity of the traditional pillars of the Icelandic economy. Now, what happened at the same time, I think this may have also a relevance to the situation you are in here, where you're very dominant, where you're very dependent on oil, as we were on fisheries for a long time. And I think the potential that Oman has in tourism and other sectors is so obvious. And the effect of tourism in Iceland came in without anybody really planning to create anything that could have created that effect. But whereas our economy had been dominated by fisheries and energy or energy-intensive industries, the publicity we had gained, as well as a few very optically beautiful volcanic eruptions, all created an interest in Iceland, and the rise in tourism was beyond anything anybody could have foreseen or planned. We have benefited, as I think Oman can, from the fact that there are more and more people who are relatively affluent, who have more time, who want to go to interesting and exotic places and spend some time there, and that generates an economic effect, which has been very beneficial to Iceland, and I'm sure that I think Oman has unlimited opportunities to do the same. So this, of course, the rise in tourism, and tourism now accounting for currency revenues equal to fisheries and energy combined, is nothing less than an economic revolution with certain drawbacks, because it's not something that you want to occur or have happening too fast. It can have negative side effects, but all in all, it is an asset. It is something very positive. So we have gained tremendously from that. This is a slide that I just wanted to show. This is the Gini coefficient. We are a very egalitarian society. We have a very progressive tax system. So we tax the high earners, high income people much more than we do low income people, and the relative. And I think we have featured number 1 on the Gini index for some time. We actually do that on other indexes as well, but I won't brag, so I won't go into that. But we have a healthy situation there. Now, coming to then the part of my presentation on the public finances, which is basically what we have been occupied with in the Ministry of Finance for 10 years now. This is an interesting slide, and it shows how revenue was developing and how expenditures were developing during the times of upheaval. One of the difficulties we had, and I think Oman would have the same if that were the case, is that during times of high increase in revenue, there is a tendency to increase spending correspondingly. That certainly happened in Iceland, and any Minister of Finance will be in a very difficult position when revenue is just flowing in, and it's difficult to say, no, let's use this money or these resources on something else. However, we found ourselves at the time of the crash with having paid out and down all sovereign debt. Without that, we would not have retained our economic independence. So luckily for us, in 2008, the treasury in Iceland was virtually debt-free. Then this big blue column shows the turnaround. And this is very dramatic. When state revenues go down 12%, measured as a part of GDP, that is serious news, and that is something that people in finance ministries will dread. This shows the trajectory, how we responded fiscally, and you can see the red line or the orange line. It dropped because tax income was reduced immediately. And you can see the grain line. Expenditures rose at the same time. Why? Because you would have to pay people unemployment benefits, you would have to increase allocations to schools, to all kinds of programs, and social assistance. And the government in Iceland at the time undertook and embarked on all kinds of initiatives to soften the effect of the crisis on ordinary people and families and households. So the gap between the gray line and the red one, the columns, actually are indicative of the accumulation of debt. Now, in 2008, the Treasury was debt-free. But we had to finance the banks. We had to increase public expenditure, and so on and so forth. We had to go to the market and borrow money. Interest costs spiraled and went up to almost 20% of our budget. The debt went from 0 to 90 in 2.5 years. And they actually went further up, because when we cite the figure 90, then we are only looking at the books of the Treasury. If we combine then and add what the central bank took on in debt in the form of loans from the IMF, from our partners, countries, then the gross debt of Iceland rose to around 115%, which is perhaps for some countries like Italy and others not very foreign territory, but for us it is very high. And as you can see, during the period of stabilization, we have been performing well, and debt accumulation was stopped, and as I will tell you in a minute, has come down considerably. But most importantly, we have now had a stability for a number of years. We have been running budget surpluses now ever since 2013. And we have been using those surpluses to pay down debt. This is the reversal in the fiscal position. I think I have covered this already. But this is an interesting chart. And it shows the trajectory of the debt. The orange part of the columns are the municipalities, the blue are the central government. Now, having gone up to 150% of GDP in debt, we, in the organic budget law, which I will now be coming to, measure debt in two ways. We use the Maastricht criteria, the gross debt criteria that most countries do, and we also look at the net position. And the red line you see there is the limit that we introduced in our organic budget law. And we are very proud to say that by the end of this year, 2018, we believe that we have come just beneath the 30% limit. And that is in net terms. In gross terms, it's about 33% of GDP. So we are rather proud of ourselves being able to say this, that we have gone from 115 to 33. And these are numbers that actually matter, because for Iceland, it is expensive to have to go to the market to borrow money. We are paying much higher interest on our sovereign borrowing, especially domestically. So in order to be able to operate the Treasury and the budget with a surplus, we have to deliver much higher primary surpluses than others. That is, excluding the financial balance, looking at the primary, the operational balance, we have been having a very healthy surplus year on year for some 5 to 6 years now. And we have been and this is the role of the finance ministry. You need to convince people that the most sensible thing to do if you owe money and you have a surplus is to pay down debt. And that is what we've been doing. This shows the picture in where we are compared to other countries in 2016. The situation has actually improved a lot since 2016. But on the chart to the right, you can actually see the actual borrowing cost of the financial and the interest balance, which even if we have come this far down in debt, is still weighing very heavily on the budget. Now I realize that time is passing, so to the last part of my presentation. With retrospect, and when we asked how was it possible that we came to finding ourselves in a situation where things have become this bad, we do not want to end up there again. So we said we probably need to give a very critical look on as to how we conduct our fiscal matters. And I chaired a commission or a working group established in 2012 to revise or to prepare a thorough reform of our entire fiscal regime. And we knew that the fiscal policy had been pro-cyclical, that during times of expansion, public expenditure had risen. So during contraction and lower income, you would have to follow the cycle and reduce public expenditure when it was most painful. So we said, given where we are, what we see is that we need to align monetary, economic, and fiscal policies. We cannot set our fiscal policy regardless of what the economic outlook is. So we, with the assistance of an expert panel, developed a whole new legislation. We call it an organic budget law. It's difficult to grasp why organic, but organic because it is holistic. So this fiscal law is primarily geared to enhancing safety, to enhancing the alignment of monetary and fiscal policy. So in our new budget law, we have an entirely new component. The introduction, the first few articles are what we call the macro fiscal part, the policy part, stipulating the issues that you need to identify and take into consideration when you set out your fiscal policy and your fiscal strategy. These things hang together. So not only is it imperative that you look towards the wider economic environment, you also need to look ahead. And we, like many others, have been very bad in observing fiscal limits or budgetary limits. We did a study of how well we had observed the budget over 2 decades and found out that the deviations had been very substantial, on par with full respect, countries like Italy and Hungary. So this was one of the priorities that we identified. You need to set medium and long-term objectives. If you just play the budget year by year, then in the end, you are going to end up in a place where you never wanted to go. So it is imperative for the Ministry of Finance and the budgetary authorities and for the leadership in government, any cabinet, to have a clear objective as to where you want to go fiscally. And then you adopt the yearly budget accordingly. So we made a lot of changes. We stopped, I'll now go into a few of the key features of this new organic budget law. we stopped looking at expenditures on the basis of ministries. And we said, well, why should we divide our expenditures on the basis of the organization of the executive? The executive can be, the organization can be, ministries come and go, and it's much more consequent to look at the nature of the expenditures. So rather than having a budget proposal consisting of 700 items, as we did, we now have a budget proposal consisting of 35. And they are not ministries, they are expenditure categories. Under those 35 categories, we have 100 issue areas. Now, this is this has actually had far-reaching implications. One of the most positive ones is that you get an entirely different kind of a discussion on the budgetary bill in Parliament. You don't simply have the individual ministries or ministers quarreling about who is getting what. You have a discussion on the contents and the context of the individual expenditure areas. And it's much easier, we have learned, to gain a broad consensus on how you want to spend your money intelligently when you view it from that different angle. We did also introduce fiscal rules. And I believe for a country like Oman, I was reading the Oman Times today and saw the decrease or the slump in revenue due to lowering oil prices. This would probably be very, very difficult. But for us, it was very important. We decided to introduce 3 basic fiscal rules. They will be rather similar to the rules that you have in the EU on the fiscal compact, but they are quite simple. And I think they can be of universal reference to any country in the world. We first said that for any 5-year period, the overall balance would have to be positive. The deficit, this is the balance rule, the deficit should never be more than 2.5% on an annual basis. With swinging oil prices, that would be very difficult in Oman. But in Iceland, we have no excuse not to be able to do this. Number 2, we said debt should be below 30% net debt of GDP. When we set this target in the budgetary bill, in the bill on the organic budget law, we had a debt of 50-something%. So people said, well, this is very ambitious. How on earth? This is more of an academic exercise then. But as it turned out, hopefully by the end of next week, we will be right there at the 30% threshold. And the third rule is the debt reduction rule, which says that whilst you're above the 30%, for any year you should reduce the difference between where you are and the 30% by 5% annually. And when this was first discussed in Parliament, this was greeted with great skepticism. But as the discussion matured, then more and more politicians, members of Parliament, came to see that this was actually in their favor. It is better to be a parliamentarian when you're working in a stable environment than having to, find your way forward step by step. So this is the fiscal rules are an integral part of the the new organic budget law. There are a number of other measures that we undertook aimed at instilling discipline in the system. So we have a much more stringent surveillance now by Parliament, and we have now an independent fiscal council, which will come and say to the authorities if the budget they are putting forward is not in line with the law, or if something is being done that risks that is not in full compliance with the 5 basic values of fiscal policy. And in the bill, we actually put forward these 5 values and said any policy, be it the budget, the medium-term plan, or longer-term plan, should be based on generic values: sustainability, prudence, stability, caution, and transparency. Now, to have philosophical values like that in a legislation on budgetary affairs may seem far-fetched, but it's not. It is very good for the minister, for the government, to be able to refer to those very sensible and simple values as the guiding principles for anything they do. I probably exceeded my time. I could go endlessly. I realize that I may be bordering on or that you've been very patient with me. Thank you. I think I will leave it there. All in all, I would say we have been doing many things, and we are very happy which have turned out to be well advised. We are very happy to be able to share it with you, and we stand ready to provide advice to you on any matter. I was invited to dinner by Mr. Abdulsalam Al-Mushidi yesterday, and he was identifying the potentials of growth for Oman, and they certainly seem to be many and abundant. And I have already, following our conversation yesterday, I hope secured a place for an Omani on the United Nations University program on fisheries in Iceland, and we would be happy to lend you whatever help we can. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. I don't think people want to be in your experience, what you had. It must have been a nerve-wracking. So just going back to getting out of the crisis, if I may, how did the government organize the team to actually does this task?
I think I think I would probably have difficulties in trying to define precisely the membership to this team. What you need to be able to secure when you're trying to recover and find a way out of a bad situation is that you need to find a modus operandi where you get people to work together. The finance ministry was in the forefront on those issues, but there were a number of issues which we did not engage in. Offering new educational projects to adults who were out of work, making sure that there would be a social safety net for families which were distressed, organizing all kinds of assistance for households that had become insolvent. We were not necessarily part of all that, but the the issues that I have been discussing, were the Ministry of Finance, the Ministry of Economic Affairs, because we had a separate Ministry of Economic Affairs at the time, and the Prime Minister's office, as well as the central bank, formed a group of institutions that worked very closely together. But it was a very small group. And I think that is what, if you ask anybody who has gone through a crisis, they will all tell you the same story, that in the end, there are only that many people you can have sitting around the table to decide things.
You also mentioned that you worked with the IMF, and different countries have different experiences with the IMF, but your experience was positive.
Yes, I think Iceland actually came to the rescue of the IMF. IMF had become rather somewhat redundant or sitting idle for some time. Then came the financial crisis, and the IMF went through a period of renewal. Their mission all of a sudden became very relevant again. Interestingly, in Europe, in Western Europe, having to enter a cooperation agreement with the IMF is not considered to be something that you want to do. And people even blush at having to admit that they have had a program with the IMF. I will say we did not let such considerations stand in the way of getting forward. We had a fantastic and a very good cooperation with the IMF. They were our partners. And we said to them right at the outset, we're happy to have you. We appreciate the fact that you want to assist, but this is our program, and we will drive it through.
You mentioned capital controls and how easy to get into them and how difficult to get out of them. But what about maintaining them? Was that something, was there leakages? Was there?
Yes, I mean, capital controls are distortive by nature. If you don't have the free flow of capital, then allocation becomes skewed. And it's not something that you want to operate. It's very labor intensive. You have to screen every transaction going in and out of the country, and somehow it's per se or in itself a negative thing. The reason why the process of abolishing capital controls became so protracted was the sheer level of uncertainty, and the sheer uncertainty as to how the volumes of assets held by foreigners stuck in Iceland. And it wasn't until the workout of the asset workout in the resolution committees of the fallen banks was finished that we actually realized the scale of the problem. We actually now, if I may add, we have, because we are a very small currency area, we've been doing very well. We have had a lot of the prospects of the economy have been good. We had a 7% growth in 2016. So there has been a lot of will amongst of carry traders to come in and to invest in kronas and then exit at some point in time, earn interest and then exit when the krona would have appreciated. So we have now something that we call a capital flow management tool, which is a levy on inflows of capital aimed at reducing speculative carry trade. And this is recognized by the OECD, by the IMF, and others as a macro-prudential measure which small currency areas may have to resort to under special circumstances.
I will ask some of the questions from the floor. The first one is about the conservative regulatory regime post the financial crisis. and it seems that you have overcorrected. Are you not worried about the growth of the economy not reaching its potential because of these conservative measures?
Yes, we are. And I think one should not be, you should not kill a fly with a hammer. The measures taken to ensure adequate capital ratios in the banks were justified at the time, and they were in line with a general philosophy of cautiousness and prudence. But we have now had a green paper. It was published 2 weeks ago on the future of the financial sector. And one of the findings that they come to there is that we are overburdening the financial sector with capital requirements and in some respects with taxation. So any healthy society needs a healthy financial system, and the environment has to be conducive.
Another question is, if you had the funds in 2008, would you have bailed out the banks?
No, absolutely not. Because I think there is a distinction to be made in that I don't think the sovereign, the taxpayer, should assume responsibility for the doings of any sector. And in this case, the sheer level of uncertainty was such that you could not have taken such decisions without taking on a serious risk. Everything was up for grabs.
Another question is about the outlook of the world GDP and economy. What are your expectations 2019 and beyond?
The economy, our economy, is doing relatively well. We have a healthy marine sector. We have a healthy energy sector. Tourism has been growing and will probably continue to grow. It is not without difficulties that you have sectors such as tourism developing so fast. If you had asked me a year ago, we would have said that our biggest concern at the time was that Iceland was contracting the Dutch disease, that the growth of tourism was producing such an appreciation of the Icelandic krona that it threatened to kill off all other sectors, especially the fragile IT sectors and other export sectors. Now things look for us fairly stable, but I think we are like Oman, very deep. We are a small, open economy, as you are. So anything that may happen in the U.S., events in the Eurozone, the Brexit process, they all underline the interdependence of the international economic system. So our concerns in that respect would be perhaps not that different from those of Oman.
What does increased flexibility in the budget implementation means?
Increased?
You mentioned increased flexibility in the budget law.
Yeah.
What does that actually mean?
By flexibility, the way we do this now, and I probably did not explain this well enough during my presentation, is that the new law has 3 components. Any new cabinet has to bring a statement of fiscal policy to Parliament, and that statement covers its entire period in office. If they do not win support for this policy, then they need to go back and produce a new one, or the government simply fails, does not have a majority. Then we do yearly 5-year plans. And then on the basis of those yearly 5-year plans, we do the budget. So what we now have is that we have, when you're looking 5 years ahead at a time, you are simply in a better position to plan. And you can be more strategic in the way you allocate resources when you have a 5-year period rather than the one fiscal year.
You mentioned 30% cap, debt to GDP. Why 30%?
That's a very good question. You probably may be familiar with the Maastricht criteria. Those are the fiscal rules of the European Union. They have a balance rule, such as we do, but they also have a debt fiscal rule saying that no country should owe more than 60% of GDP in gross terms, excluding pension liabilities. When we wrote the bill, we first set this target at 45%. But as time progressed and the economic prospects improved, we said we are probably justified in going further, in creating bigger buffers. So, and given that we are a small economy depending on only a few basic sectors where there may be volatility, we should probably be more cautious than others. And I think this would probably apply to Oman as well. That when you are easily subjected to external shocks, you need to be more cautious.
This question about tourism. During your capital controls and currency volatility, how did your tourism industry grow?
The tourism sector has not really been affected that much by the capital controls as such. For any convenience, you can use your credit card, you can pay anything. There is no control on anything, and never was. So not even in 2009, where things were at their weakest, did we have any controls on individual expenditures and so forth.
And I think the final question, because we have to give you some dinner. What happened to the regulatory supervision in the run-up to the crisis 2008?
It was...
I think the implication is that they didn't do their job, so what was wrong there?
Yes, I think that is very true. And this is one of the findings of the Parliament's investigatory report, that even if we were allocating increased resources to financial sector supervision, it was no way far enough. We were not going far enough. So I would guess that now that we have this is typical. Now that we have a financial system that is only a fraction of what it used to be, we have probably increased contributions to surveillance like 5 times. So again, we may be overdoing it.
Well, at the end of this, I want to thank you so much for really taking the time, particularly that it's out of your family holiday. And I hope that you enjoy your time here. On behalf of everyone, thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Your Excellency Guðmundur Árnason, for your inspiring presentation, and thank you, Mr. Mohammed Al-Ardi, for this amazing insights and wonderful interaction. I'm sure we will all learn from the Icelandic experience. Right now, I'm actually going to call you back on the stage as Mr. Mohammed Al-Ardi would like to present our guest speaker, His Excellency, with a token of appreciation. So please welcome on the stage again. I'm sure there were lots of questions and people wanted them to be answered, but unfortunately we ran out of time. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you've enjoyed the program for today. I'd like to remind you to kindly share your opinion about this event using the feedback forms that are available on your tables. As we look forward to the next event in 2019, on behalf of Suhar International, to express our gratitude and appreciation to each one of you for attending this event, and we invite you all for dinner. My name is Hiyam Al-Jabri. It's been a pleasure being your MC tonight, and have a good weekend, good year ahead, and Happy New Year. Thank you so much.